Maybe capitalism isn't the answer to rebuilding in the post-apocalyptic world. The Wasteland of the Fallout series is uniquely suited to a centrally planned model of economic development, not only because factions like the Brotherhood or the Enclave have the organizational skill to formulate the plan, the technical skill to make it possible, and the military capability to drive the population toward the end goal, but like the Soviet Union or Maoist China during their early decades, they don't actually have to invent anything to build up a modern industrial economy. They can copy it. Let's look at the Brotherhood of Steel again, as their entire reason for existing is to scour the ruins and seize what's left of the means of production. They have some experience with large long-term projects. The design and construction of the Prydwen was a 5-year plan on its own, and it was their stepping into Project Purity that allowed for securing the site from supermutants, completing the project, and setting up water distribution, even if they bungled the details at the last stage. And they have this scruffy Stalinist to show us the way forward. Backward. Whatever it is. For a historical example, let's consider the Soviet automotive industry. After the revolution, the Bolsheviks were obsessed with industrializing Russia, and this obsession fixated on America. In 1925 through 26, the head of the USSR State Planning Commission was traveling across America to learn about industrial practices. In the process, he became convinced that the Soviet Union needed proper roads and a real car industry. They ended up not only copying Detroit's Taylorist scientific management and automotive designs, but in 1929 they signed a deal with the Ford Motor Company to have them design a factory and provide all the machinery and 70,000 unassembled vehicles so they could work it all out. As Joseph Stalin once said, the combination of the Russian revolutionary sweep with American efficiency is the essence of Leninism. This is one example among many of how the Soviet Union became an industrial power so quickly. The benefit of their centrally planned economy was its ability to control national resources and devise a national-level plan, including large purchases of machinery and expertise from capitalist countries, sometimes with money borrowed from capitalists, in order to copy the industrial techniques they needed. You have to be kind of a dumbass capitalist to loan money to a government that has already repudiated all of its debts once and openly expresses a desire to destroy you. But hey, greed makes you stupid. It worked. They built up a huge industrial capacity in a remarkably short span of time, though at an immense cost in human suffering. In Fallout's world, North America is littered with partially intact factories and machine shops. Instructional manuals almost certainly survive as well, often in close proximity to the machinery. The Brotherhood's airship, the Prydwen, is a testament to this, constructed entirely from salvaged material and reconstructed technical skills. This is how they maintain and possibly build new power armor, vertibirds, and small arms. The designs have been unchanged for 200 years. There's no real technical progress. But we're more concerned with elevating social and economic conditions right now. The first time around, it took centuries to progress through the feudal stage into industrial capitalism, which created the technological and social conditions that Marx built his theories on. You can't have a proletarian revolution without first having a proletarian class, after all. But thanks to the ruins of the old world serving as detailed templates, in the post-war wasteland we can skip the feudal and capitalist stages and go straight to the centralized, state-directed socialism that, in theory, will lay the groundwork for true communism and happy times for all. Even if it doesn't work out that way, it pulls people out of subsistence farming and gets the lights back on. So after wiping out the raider gangs in a swift and brutal campaign, we need to increase food production, which means we need clean water and arable land. The Brotherhood has some experience with this. We need to establish population centers and ways of getting food from the farms to the people. How big these population centers need to be will be partly dependent on how many robots can be salvaged to do manufacturing and construction work. And the solution should be reasonably low-tech and not dependent on salvage machines, because it needs to be scalable and therefore can't rely on finding intact engines and robots sitting around in garages. Which brings us to one of the structural flaws in central planning we have to work within. The planners can only plan for things they already understand. Whatever we do here will not encourage innovation, and in many cases finding a new way to do something will be disruptive to the rest of the plan. So we need specific goals and specific methods for achieving them. Otherwise we can't plan, and the plan is necessarily limited to things we already know how to do and can accurately quantify. So something like Roman-style aqueducts or canals for irrigation, and steam locomotives for transportation. First we have to survey the land, determine where the farms, towns, and industrial centers should be, and design the new infrastructure according to that geography and climate. While most of Fallout's stories take place in the arid west and the northeast coast in the Boston and DC areas, these are not the optimal places to set up an agricultural base. Maybe the Carolinas, the Mississippi Delta, the Ohio Valley. I'm going to go with the Willamette Valley in this case, just because I have some experience growing small plot crops there, so I'm not talking completely out of my ass. And Interplay's lost lore of Fallout games that never happened includes Fort Willamette, a Brotherhood of Steel base in the region. The Brotherhood, Western Oregon, commies. Almost tailor-made for this scenario. So for the sake of discussion, let's say we've got our Phase 1 farmland figured out. Irrigation team is already at work, and we're planning the railroad connecting agricultural collectives and transfer centers in, say, Dallas, Monmouth, Corvallis, and the administrative center at Fort Willamette. Lighter traffic goes by dirt roads and donkeys. We'll fix that later. We're going to need a lot of steel to make the train tracks and locomotives. Steel production concentrates atmospheric radiation in the metal due to the high volume of air pulled into the blast furnace, making for a rather unhealthy work environment. But we have a few bits of good news. First, the 7-10 rule. For every 7-fold increase in time from the blast, radiation drops 10-fold. It's been 200 some years. If we were making Geiger counters, they might be a little shifty, but we're making train tracks. And at this stage, we don't actually need to make steel because we can melt down cars and I-beams from the ruins of Portland and Salem, so that saves us some steps. Worst case, it's a Soviet-style industrial model. Sacrifices may be necessary for progress. So we set up a foundry on each site, and we'll have to move the track sections on ox carts, but we have to level the ground for the tracks anyway, so the construction roads are incidental. We need to make ties, but lumber shouldn't be a problem, though loggers and building a mill will consume a solid chunk of time and resources. Also, there's not much coal to mine there, so the trains will have wood-fired boilers. We're going to need a lot of timber. Workers, though. We can round up as many functional protectrons as we can find and set them all to construction mode, but I wouldn't count on having enough to lay the entire track line. They have to be supervised anyway, because have you seen these things? If the best case, where all we need are foremen, we'll be limited by the size of this Brotherhood chapter's qualified personnel. More likely the project will need a lot of dudes swinging hammers and working saws, in which case things get a bit more complicated. The modern capitalist answer is to hire a bunch of guys, but this doesn't work because it's not a market economy. It's a bunch of dirt farmers on the edge of starvation. If we hire them all to work the railroad, no one is growing food. We could provide them with all the essentials directly instead of pay, but only if we already had a massive agricultural base. No, to make this work, or rather, to make them work, we're going to have to impose some new arrangements. I should point out here that a certain degree of coercion is present in all economic systems. In our modern capitalism, you need to work a job to pay for food and shelter, and if you decide to drop out of the system and live off your land, the taxman and some cops will show up to let you know that isn't going to fly. It's a similar principle, but much less overt than the Soviet forced collectivization of farms. Which is what we're going to do here. The locals are understandably upset about having their farms nationalized or being shipped off to work some other plot of land, but we have the power armor and the big guns, so what are they going to do about it? And through this collectivization, we can more efficiently work the land, increasing crop yields enough to free up some of the population to work the foundries and build the railroad. We'll just assume that taking people off land they farmed for generations and dropping them into totally new plots with different crops will go entirely smoothly. Now, everyone is expecting me to go on a tirade about the failures of Stalin's collectivization, but I'm not going to, because Soviet comparisons really start to break down here. The Soviet Union existed in a mostly industrial capitalist world, and while we have a similar situation of being able to copy existing machinery and methods, we don't have the option of borrowing money to buy anything on the international market. It doesn't exist. We're entirely on our own. The plan has to fit the real-world conditions. Just as Marx was writing about mid-19th century industrial conditions that don't exist in the same form today, the post-apocalyptic wasteland doesn't map one-to-one either. So let's err on the optimistic side of realism and say it takes us 7 years to complete our first 5-year plan. We have some productive farms, we have 2 small industrial centers starting to shift from making railroad tracks and a couple steam engines to tractors and machine tools, and we have a steady flow of foodstuffs and manufactured goods through our little socialist state. We've made real progress here. Things have gotten better faster than anyone could have thought possible. I mean, some people are still whining about losing their family farms, and there's some grumbling about factory conditions, but come on, man, suck it up. Now we can repeat the process, expanding outward. Except we have another problem. Our border is porous. Raiders from outside have stepped up their game, going after our high-value shipments of food and manufactured goods, and we don't have the manpower to thoroughly patrol the entire valley. We might be good communists, sharing the fruits of our labor according to the plan of our benevolent elders, but to everyone outside our communities, we've become the haves, and the have-nots want a piece. Also, at this point, we don't know what the NCR looks like, but they're still around in some form, whether as a rival pseudo-capitalist nation-state, a well-disciplined militia gang, or something in between. So we're going to need more soldiers, reducing our labor pool for production, and we end up with the old guns and butter problem. We have a limited productive capacity, and we're going to need a lot of guns. But how many? And what kind exactly? We can make 6, maybe 8 submachine guns for the same materials and labor to make a single heavy machine gun. Sometimes you need to suppress targets 600 yards out, and one machine gun is worth more than all the 9mm blowbacks in the world. On the other hand, if you and the boys try to clear a building with MG42s, well, good luck with that. So we take all the data we have and allocate our finite resource base on what we think we're going to need over the next few years. How many of what kinds of guns to make, appropriate ratio of ammunition, which crops to grow and how much goes to supplying the army, what percentage of our railway capacity is going to be needed for military use and at the expense of what, all while making sure that our population of workers have shoes, that we have electricity for the factories and the schools we've had to set up to turn the kiddos into productive workers. We can't rely on market feedback like price increases or consumer shifts to substitute products, and no one is going to step in to fill the gaps. We have to figure it all out for the entire population.
Another settlement has sent word that they need our help.
We have to predict the future. And here we have another of the inherent limits of central planning. There are techno-socialists who will argue that, sure, in the 1930s the Soviets couldn't make enough shoes or bread because they had a lot of gaps and lags in their data, but today we have computers that can track total economic activity in real time and project needs from a complete data set. Only it's not a problem of data collection, but of variables. An economy is not a machine that works in a linear fashion, this part moving that one in a clear and repeating manner. It's more like an ecosystem, full of feedback loops and counterbalances. Trying to centrally plan a national economy is like trying to plan the weather. You may have an elegant model, but you're still standing in the rain with your sunglasses on, insisting that it's time to go to the beach. And because you can't plan for innovation, you don't get a lot of it in the planned economy. What you do get is shortages of some things and big piles of others. The army is going to have heavy machine guns because they're the single consumer for them and they work directly for the government doing the planning. But are they going to have enough socks? Are the farmers, factory workers, and everyone else going to have enough work boots and farm implements and fertilizers? There are things that people need and want at any given time, and we don't have a good way of determining what and when far enough out to plan the entire national economy around it in advance. And since even those personal but necessary items come back to raw material allocations at the heart of our economy, we do have to plan for all of it if we're going this route. We also have to acknowledge the relationship of labor and markets here, because like a capitalist system, our workers are now market dependent. Whether we pay them in money, in ration vouchers, or some kind of social credit scheme, the basic mechanism is they need to work a job for someone else in order to purchase necessities like food and shelter. But because everyone is employed by the same entity, the People's Brotherhood of Steel, there's no employers competing for workers, so wages remain relatively flat, probably according to some labor theory of value. Let's talk about that. The simple core argument of Marxism is that these people do most of the work and these other people get most of the money. It's not fair and we should do something about it. Well, yeah, no one's going to argue against that except these guys. But that's not a political platform or a plan of action. What Marx did is turn an essentially philosophical argument into a scientifically framed one. That's what the whole historical materialism thing is about, and also how he used the labor theory of value. For all his flaws, Karl Marx was not a moron, so of course he knew that not just any labor works for this. If you spend 3 days making an exquisitely shaped and balanced mud pie, that doesn't make your bowl of mud valuable. So Marx specifies socially necessary labor, which is left deliberately vague. Because it has to be. Because if he defines it as labor that produces something useful to someone, he's dangerously close to saying that value is subjective. But you can't have subjective value when you're making an argument that profit is the result of capitalists cheating labor out of a percentage of the true value of their work. So any labor theory of value, like its offshoot, the value-added tax, will always be calculated according to a formula with essentially arbitrary values plugged in, because it's trying to objectively measure a subjective thing. So back to the recovery. We've built up a solid agricultural base and some industry, but we also have a dysfunctional market economy and a highly authoritarian government, because central planning is inherently authoritarian. I mean, central planning. And given the size of the surrounding lands inhabited by hostile armed groups increasingly aware of the fertile land we're sitting on and the bounty we're pulling from it, coupled with the high probability that technology will remain stagnant, we're looking at diminishing returns. So we go to the elders and we say, look, old dudes, this has gotten us out of the dirt, and we gotta hand it to you that the grass really is greener over shallow graves. But all the easy wins are behind us, and the people are starting to want more out of life now that their stomachs aren't totally empty. What have you done for me lately? There's a couple of ways to handle this. There's the approach used by Mao, Stalin, the Kims in North Korea, and would almost certainly be the enclave approach. Clamp down and silence anyone that doesn't stay in line. Crush resistance, rule through force and fear. The Brotherhood could go that route. Authoritarian systems tend to double down on authoritarianism when they face a challenge. If that happens, our attempt at recovery will be a horrific failure, as oppressive as Caesar's legion and far more industrious, but brittle and unable to adapt. It'll probably fall hard and cause a lot of pain before it goes. But it's a bit of a cop-out to just play the communism always leads to tyranny card. There is some cause to be optimistic, because the Brotherhood has always been a militant religious order more than a full-on despotic entity. Trying to rule with an iron fist is extremely resource-intensive and gets in the way of that core mission of recovering and preserving technology. A mission that was aligned with the early stages of this centrally planned recovery, but which is now starting to bifurcate. Instead of going Stalinist, we can delegate some functions. We won't hand off control of the collective farms to the people working them, of course. They need to keep delivering. But we could send a paladin and a few knights to run them with a high degree of autonomy. I don't care how you run the place, as long as the grain gets delivered on time. We still have the Brotherhood overseeing the broad economy, controlling the commanding heights through appointed supervisors in the factories, but the agricultural fiefdoms are the purview of the paladin appointed to run them. There's still a command economy, but responsibility for the details has been delegated down to smaller units that are more responsive to local conditions. The Brotherhood still gets its annual allotment of foodstuffs, manufactured goods, and squires, but the details are handled by people on site that know the intricacies of their little slice of the world. We just invented steampunk feudalism. Because here's the thing. While we've been building our little state socialist community, the rest of the world is still there, doing what it's been doing for generations. We're a little island of central planning in a vast sea of people doing whatever they need to on any given day. And we don't have the manpower or the productive capacity to sweep across the land in all directions, wiping out resistance and educating the populace on the benefits of the Great Revolution. We're surrounded by armed tribes that think we're weirdos and want to take our stuff. But we can expand more gradually and meet the world halfway. Find an area we want to expand into, send an expeditionary force, clear it of hostiles, and build a fort. That establishes a radius free of raiders and projects a semblance of legal authority. Trading hubs spring up around the forts. The markets become towns and farms start around them. We don't need to build everything or plan everything, only provide the sense of protection and stability that a small garrison of power-armored knights projects. People are industrious. They'll do the rest themselves without being told how. Some of what they try will fail, but they'll fail small. Others will learn from it, and the whole society will gradually get better. And yes, they'll trade. Markets will form. People will produce goods to fill gaps in the planned production, and they'll make a profit doing it. In the new areas, people will eventually set up their own sawmills because everyone needs construction materials. Some mining, some manufacturing will begin to fill unmet needs. Private industry. In time, they may even compete with some of the state-run industries or have work subcontracted to them. And the whole society will benefit from it, though some will benefit more than others. Meanwhile, the Brotherhood can return to its core functions of maintaining an army and searching for technological artifacts of the old world. They'll still have paladins running fiefs, appointing new ones as the territory expands, and the original foundries and lumber mills will still be owned by the Brotherhood, by the state, but they'll only require a few permanent technicians and managers on site. Even policing functions can be handed off to the locals, sheriffs chosen by the local paladin, or perhaps even elected by the population. Soldiers make bad cops anyway, it's not at all the same job. This approach, feudal with some industrial elements, is more compatible with the world that it exists within. It can change that world by engaging with it instead of trying to force it to conform to a plan. Because ultimately, the core problem with centrally planned economies isn't the conceit of being able to predict future demand of everything, or the hubris of believing that the entire material sphere of human interaction can be managed, but that a planned economy treats human lives as a commodity to be indexed, assigned, and expended. And human beings don't want to live that way. I've got buzzards circling me up on the mountain here, that's probably not a good sign.